All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Dr. Jenny Liu from the School of Urban Studies and Planning. And today we're very happy to have Justin Beaujon here from University of Washington, Tacoma. He is a transportation economist and got his PhD in agricultural and resource economics from UC Davis. And he is here to talk to us about whether public transit's green reputation is deserved. So, nothing here.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jenny, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming to listen to me. So this paper is one that I've been working on for a little while now. This was the third paper of my dissertation that I was trying to rush out the door to graduate, and now I'm coming back to it. I do have a rough draft posted on my website if you're interested in looking at this. It still is a work in progress that I'm hoping to update shortly, but it is available there if you Google me if you're so inclined. This is some work with Cynthia Lynn Lowell at Cornell University. And so I will mention too, if you have any questions as I go, feel free to ask along the way. So the kind of broad theme of my research is kind of captured here. And it's really evaluating this idea that, or this kind of claim, I guess, that public transit is this kind of sustainable alternative to the car, right? So it's kind of almost this kind of common knowledge that transit is something that can be used to reduce congestion, improve air quality. And for the last little while, I've been trying to look at whether there's evidence to support these claims. And so as an economist, my answer is maybe, which is kind of always our answer. And so I wanted to get into a bit about why there's a maybe there, when we think that this might be true and when maybe not so true. Okay? So I'm losing my clicker here.
Yeah, the clicker stopped working.
Yeah.
I have another one.
That's it. Okay. There's just the screen seems to be frozen. Okay, I'll click for now. Okay, so here is kind of a summary of the data set that I've put together, which I think is very representative of the US as a whole. It's looking at the improvement in air quality that we've experienced over the last couple decades. And I think that this is pretty significant looking at how much it has improved in a very short time period. So going back to, Going back to 1991 down to 2011, with 1991 as our starting point, we can see kind of the reduction in measured pollutants in the air across the US. So ozone has remained fairly stable. Particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide have decreased by 30–35% over that time period. Sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide have decreased by more than 70%, right? So that's a very significant change. And even more stark if we carry that back out to the 70s when the EPA was first introduced. So air quality has gotten a lot better in the US. It's not perfect still, but it's definitely a lot better than it had been. And so if we look over this kind of same time period, public transit has expanded as well, right? And so this is again using 1991 as a reference point. This is an aggregate of a bunch of large cities in the US. I'll explain my data set in a little while. The kind of summary here is that the amount of transit has increased pretty significantly over this time period. And the way that it has really changed is in terms of its access, the accessibility of transit, basically how many different routes there are, okay? So overall, there's about a 35% increase in the amount of people taking transit in terms of ridership. And that's caused mainly by network size, okay? So the directional route miles, basically how many people are served by transit, has increased. Transit service frequency has been pretty consistent, right? So the amount of kind of transit operating over the network has been pretty stable, but that network has expanded, okay? And so over this time period, more people are taking transit, but we're not really seeing any reduction in congestion, right? So travel time index has increased a little bit over this time period. It's been fairly stable. So we have this kind of combination where we have less pollution, we have a little bit more congestion, a lot more people taking transit. So how do we kind of parse that out and say, well, what is the effect of transit service, transit supply on congestion and then on air quality. And so I think this is a really important question. There's been a lot of projects that are kind of in the works and being proposed that have this kind of motivation at its heart, right? So in Washington, where I am, there's been a very big deal in terms of transit investment recently. So Sound Transit had this new project, ST3, which was passed in November 2016 at the ballot boxes. This happened a couple months after I moved to the state. And so this is a very big project. So the number that gets bandied about a lot is this $54 billion in capital expenditures. Most of it is for light rail. And so it stretches across most of the state, up from Everett down to Tacoma. A lot of the action is obviously in the middle around Seattle. But it's this big, large-scale investment in transit. And a lot of the kind of motivation or the argument is that it's going to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled by cars by a big number over some kind of nebulous time period that isn't very clear. And it's going to help mitigate climate change. And so when I was talking with my students this first quarter when I arrived at UW Tacoma, I was trying to get a sense of what the students thought about this project, whether they were in favor of it or opposed to it. And the argument that most students made were that it's an equity issue, right? So a lot of it came to affordability. Not everybody can afford to have a car. So we're doing this in terms of access for people, especially lower income individuals. And another part of the argument was the environmental angle, right? So a lot of the students had this idea that transit was good for the environment. Okay, so it's this kind of core belief that people tend to have. Okay, a little more locally. So up in Thurston County, this was a recent newspaper article that I found a couple days ago. Again, another proposal being bandied about that people have to vote on is looking at funding for transit. And in this article, there's this statement here about trying to advocate for this support for this project. That transportation, public transit is going to increase or address increased traffic congestion, and it's going to help reduce pollution. Right. So again, this commonly held belief. I would say in the majority that this is true, and I really want to say, is this true? So these are the questions that I've been focusing on. The first one is, should public transit be used as a means to try to reduce congestion, try to improve air quality? And what I've found, and what most people have found, is that it's really an empirical question, right? So we want to look at, in the past, how effective have these public transit investments been in actually reducing congestion and improving air quality, if at all, right? And so we need to get this right. This is a lot of money, right? So on average, it's about 18 to $20 billion a year in new investments in transit in the US. And more is spent on operations and subsidies for transit as well, right? We're putting a lot of money into transit. We want to make sure that that is being spent efficiently. So I wanted to try to first look at whether this was kind of an obvious question, right? So is it clear we've seen that pollution has gone down, transit's gone up? Is this kind of an obvious thing where that's due to transit? So I just did like kind of a simple analysis looking at different areas, the extent to which they've had an increase in transit supply over this time period, and what we've observed in terms of pollution in these cities. So each of these dots, there should be 96 of them, represent a different urban area across the US. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit here. But I just wanted to look at kind of a simple correlation between changes in transit supply and changes in pollution across space. Okay? And so if we think, or if we observe that areas that have had a higher increase in transit supply, if they've had a greater reduction in pollution, we would expect to see this basically running from the top left to the bottom right, right? So as we go to the right, that's more transit being supplied. And as we go further down, that's a greater reduction in pollutants, okay? So here, carbon monoxide, again, if we look at this, it's definitely not, to my eye, running from top left to bottom right. It's fairly flat, no clear relationship. And this is true for most of the criteria pollutants. There doesn't seem to be an obvious relationship, to my eye, between how much transit we have and what the effect has been on pollution. Again, just kind of a simple correlation at first glance. Okay, so no clear relationship across these pollutants. So what has been found then? I think that this is a worthwhile question because it doesn't seem to me to be an obvious answer. Okay, and so there's been a lot of studies, over the past decades looking at auto travel and pollution. There's been a lot of interest in whether pollution is having adverse health effects for individuals, especially at-risk individuals. There's been studies looking at, do people that are giving birth close to congested freeways, are those, children being adversely affected and so on. There's been a lot of studies looking at that link between cars, pollution, and health. There haven't been a lot of studies looking at public transit and pollution. And so when I started working on this, there was very few papers. There's been a couple more that have come up along the way. And so there does seem to be a bit more of an interest in this question, but there's no real clear empirical consensus on my reading the literature in terms of whether transit has a beneficial effect on the environment or not. And so I'll talk a little bit more about these other studies in a bit here, but it does seem to be partly an open question still. And I think that's because the connection between public transit and pollution is pretty complicated, right? If we think about our transit networks, right? So if we think about the connection between transit supply and air quality, we have a lot of different moving parts here, right? So at the core of it, it really depends on the modal distribution of travel, how many people are taking the car, how many people are taking transit. And if we are going to increase transit, does that actually get people out of their cars, right? And so the cross elasticity of auto and transit is fairly quite a bit higher than the fare elasticity, right? So there's been a lot of evidence that making transit cheaper in terms of the monetary cost doesn't really make a difference, right? So if we make transit cheap, that's not really going to get people out of their cars. But if we improve transit supply, if we decrease waiting times, how long it takes you to walk to the station, those things are going to make a bigger difference. And so this is some work that I've been doing previously. And this seems to be about 4 times higher than the fare elasticity, right? So if we want to get people out of their cars into transit, we have to change the non-monetary cost of transit. The time cost is what matters, okay? So the modal shift matters. The pollutant rates matter, right? So per mile traveled by bus, by car, how much of these different pollutants are they generating? And then obviously the spatial and temporal distribution of trips, right? So where are these trips happening? Are they happening at peak times? Are they happening in kind of congested areas where a lot of people are exposed to it? It's a fairly kind of complex process here. I won't get into the details here. It's just the kind of standard negative externality story of car travel. One of the problems with, or one of the, I guess, challenges with trying to figure out what to do with regulations here, when we think about congestion and emissions, they are really interrelated, right? And so what we tend to see is that the environmental externality, how damaging pollution is going to be increasing with congestion, right? So part of this is due to the emission process, right? If you're driving and stop and start traffic, that's when most of the action comes in terms of emissions, right? And so the emissions are going to be higher because of the stop and start congestion aspect. But also in congested conditions, there's more people around, right? So you're going to be in these areas that have more people being exposed to your pollutants. So you have this kind of tricky thing where the emissions and the congestions are dependent on each other, and they're kind of interacting in that sense, right? So it makes it a bit of a challenge in terms of designing proper regulations for these two externalities. Yeah. So for this research, it's really just a reduced form approach where we're taking just to look at empirically what has happened when we've observed changes in transit supply. What has that done to pollution levels? Okay, so the approach here is basically trying to look at these different criteria pollutants. So there's 6 of them that the EPA monitors, record pollutant levels, and we want to look at what happens to air quality when transit capacity changes. Okay, so we're really interested in this red beta 1. As we change transit capacity, what does that do to air quality? And so we want to try to just control for all this other stuff that is going to potentially affect pollution levels, right? So freeway capacity is going to affect how many people are on the roads, employment levels, trucking activity, weather, pollutant regulations directly, and so forth, right? So we want to try to control for that stuff to figure out what is the contribution of transit capacity. Okay. And so I have a note here at the bottom saying that travel volumes are not included as a control on the right-hand side. And the reason we do that is to control for induced demand. And so I want to remember to come back to this idea in a bit here. And basically, this is an equilibrium model, right? And so it's kind of this longer term view where we're looking at if we change transit capacity, it's going to have a lot of these knock-on effects that are kind of going to reverberate through the system. And we want to figure out how things kind of settle down here. And part of that story is induced demand. And so I'll explain what induced demand is if you're not familiar and why we care about that in a minute. Okay. So one of the aspects here is that we look at each pollutant separately. Okay, and so this is just a correlation matrix between the different pollutants. And it just shows that there is a lot of variation in terms of how much pollutant concentration there is in a given area. And so it's not like all these pollutants are going to be concentrated in one area. They might be high in one area in conjunction with another one, high and low, both low. There's a lot of variation there, right? So these are not overly high correlations here. And so for this reason, we look at each pollutant separately. That's typically the way that it is done here. And so what we are doing here in terms of the kind of empirical approach is we're looking at this panel of time, this 1991 to 2011 stretch of 21 years, and we're looking at how has transit varied within a given region over time, and how has that variation in transit supply affected pollution levels, if at all. Okay, and so we're using these urban area fixed effects to control for what we call time invariant factors, right? So there's going to be areas that just tend to have more pollution. It could be related to atmospheric issues and so forth. So we want to control for that stuff and try to isolate, well, what is the effect of changes in transit supply? Okay, and so one potential kind of point that might trip us up right away is the kind of classic case of endogeneity, right? So we might look at this and say, well, public transit, as we talked about with the kind of motivating stories there, is people view transit supply as a way to try to ameliorate pollution. So we might expect that these transit investments are being kind of directed towards the most polluted areas, okay? And so that's going to kind of muddy the waters in trying to measure the effect of transit. So it might be as a policy measure to address existing congestion or environmental concerns. And two, it's also a part of a growth or development strategy, right? So if we think about trans investment, especially light rail and kind of fixed route operations, we view these as trying to change land use patterns, spark development, and so forth. So the very act of investing in transit might make it more appealing. People are going to move into this area, more businesses are going to come in. That's going to lead to more congestion and more pollution. Okay, so identifying the actual effect of transit on air quality could be complicated by these two aspects here. So what we do is, as economists, one way that we can try to get around this is to come up with an instrumental variable. Okay, so this is just a methodological approach to try to figure out this kind of causal effect about if we were to increase transit in a given area, what is the effect going to be? And so we need to figure out some variable that is going to be related to the level of public transit, but not kind of separately related on its own to your dependent variable, in this case, pollution and congestion, okay? So the instrument that we came up with is looking at the kind of rules for transit funding, okay? And so transit capital funding comes from basically three sources, right? So we have state, local, and federal funds. And so our argument is that these state and local funds are hopefully endogenous, right? We want these funds to be directed to areas that need transit investment, the areas that are congested, that are polluted. So those funds could be hopefully allocated efficiently. And so for better or for worse, good, I think, for our design is that federal funds in the US are typically not used efficiently. Okay? And so there's a government accountability report in 2009 that we kind of lean on here. And the idea, to my understanding, is that there's a lot of kind of old antiquated rules for how federal funds are used for transit. And the kind of punchline is that they're not necessarily directed to areas that need them the most. Okay, so we're using as an instrument just the federal funds, which we essentially view as exogenous for transit investment. Okay, so that's the approach that we are taking here. So to get into the data a bit, we are using what's called an urban area. So this is a Census Bureau definition. It is very regional in context. Our data set has 96 of them. So I'll show you a map in a second. They're all across the US. They cover 44 different states. Over this period from 1991 to 2011, there's about 2,000 different observations that we have at this level. And it is more of a regional focus. Okay, so this map shows the Seattle, Tacoma, Everett urban area. And so again, it's quite broad here, right? Some regional focus. And so this, I think, is one of the contributions that we're making in this research. Okay, and so typically the literature that has looked at the effects of transit on air quality have really looked at what I call the extensive margin. Okay, so some of the designs have looked at, what happens when transit service stops. Okay, so the paper by Nick Rivers that I mentioned in 2017, they are looking at a Canadian context about what has happened to pollution when there's been a labor disruption. Okay, so basically we go from having transit to no transit, and they look at what has happened to pollution in that kind of short time period. Okay, and so it's really nice from kind of a study design. It's a very credible setup to measure the effects of transit, but I'd argue that it's not overly policy relevant, right? For us, we're not really thinking about this case where we're going from having no transit to a bunch of transit or a bunch of transit to no transit. We're saying we already have some transit. What if we add a little bit more? What's going to happen there? Okay, so that's what we call the intensive margin, and that's what we are trying to identify in this paper. Okay, so the trade-off is that I think our approach is more relevant for policies, but it's a little messier in terms of trying to come up with that causal effect. That's just kind of the way the trade-off works here. Okay, so here is a map of the urban areas that we have in our study. Again, there's 96 of them all across the US. This is a local map of the urban area here. So it's the Portland, Vancouver, Hillsborough urban area. There are a bunch of different monitors here, and so they've come on and off at different time periods. They measure different pollutants at different time periods. Some measure just a single pollutant, some measure multiple pollutants. But again, you can see it has a fairly regional focus here. Okay, so we're looking at, if we increase transit in this area, kind of what is this broader effect on the environment? It's not a localized effect that most of the existing literature has been focusing on. And so the 6 pollutants are here, kind of on average. The top column shows in a given urban area how many monitors are there. So on average, there's 3 monitors measuring carbon monoxide, 6 measuring PM 2.5, and so forth. For the results that I have so far, I'm just taking the average value in a region. Okay, so if we look back at Portland, for instance, there's 11 or 13, whatever monitors there are. I'm looking at what is the average carbon monoxide reading in a year in this region. Okay, so I'm averaging across monitors for the results that I'm talking about so far. So for this Datastore set, it's combining a bunch of different sources, and the kind of common theme is that it's all at the urban area level. Okay, so I've taken data from the Texas Transportation Institute. They have a lot of data on congestion levels, transit supply, car traveling volumes, and so forth. The FHWA has data on freeways, highways, and fuel prices, things like that. The Federal Transit Administration, their database has the transit data, which has been merged together at the urban area level. The EPA, we're measuring ambient pollution levels, right? So the ambient level is at a given point in time, how much pollution is in the air. So it's not a flow, it's a stock. At a kind of a snapshot in a day, what was the kind of highest reading that day is how they're looking at it. Okay? And then we have weather data from NOAA and some different socioeconomic controls from the BEA. And again, this is all being recorded at the urban level, so more of a regional approach here. I did want to mention briefly another study which is relevant here, I think, in terms of how we interpret the results. This is a paper, again, with Cynthia Lynn Lowell that was recently published in GEAM. I wanted to highlight a couple of our results here, which I think are interesting and relevant in terms of how we, again, interpret the effects on pollution. Okay, so in this paper, we were looking at how does this transit supply affect car ridership. Okay, so very similar kind of design to what I've outlined here in terms of pollution, but instead of having kind of pollution as our dependent variable, we were looking at car volumes. Okay, so that initial kind of decision that I was talking about, if we increase transit supply, do people get out of their car and into transit? So it had much of the same data set, and so a couple of things that I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of heterogeneity there. Okay, and so that's one of the challenges that we face when trying to interpret some of these results, is that these urban areas can be very different, right? If we look at different aspects here, whether it's population size, population density, the types of transit they have, how much transit they have, there's a lot of variation across these different cities, right? And so one concern that we might have is that the effects in one city might not necessarily apply to what we might expect to see in Portland, right? There's this idea of external validity that we want to be cognizant of. And so this kind of highlights that concern here. So this is looking at the cross elasticity of car travel with respect to transit supply. Okay, so basically if we start out at the top here, this is saying that there's basically no effect up here, right? If we increase transit supply, doesn't affect car ridership at all. And as we move further down here, there's a bigger effect. Okay, and so what this shows here is that if we look at how this varies with population density, as we increase population density from left to right, there is more of a response where people are impacted by transit supply. Okay, so denser cities are going to have more people switch from cars to transit when we increase transit. Okay, and so we again want to be aware that the effects that we might observe in a dense city over here are going to be potentially a lot different than what we observe in a less dense city. Okay, so it's maybe kind of common sense, but we do have to remember that. And this is, I think, the most interesting result from this paper. This is looking at the timing aspect of transit investment. Okay, and so basically what this is showing is kind of the lag of the effects of transit investment on car ridership. Okay, so the way that we can kind of interpret this is that in the short run here, there is an effect on the amount of people riding their cars. This is negative, saying that in the first couple of years, if we increase transit investment in 2018, it might have some effect in the number of people in their cars for 3 or 4 years in the very short run. Over time, that effect evaporates. Okay, and so this is potentially an indication of induced demand, right? And so there's a couple different mechanisms that this could manifest itself. So if we have this investment in transit, and kind of as a thought experiment, we increase transit supply, we get a bunch of people out of their cars and into transit, what does that do? It frees up the roadways, and now it makes it more appealing for people to drive. So people before that weren't driving now observe less congestion. It's going to be quicker to get from home to work or home to grocery shopping. So now they decide to drive, and that eats away any of these time savings. Okay, so that could be part of the story. This could also be related to economic development, right? We increased transit supply in 2018. More people want to move to downtown Portland because transit is more accessible. And that, again, causes more people to drive, right? So there's a lot of different channels where that could happen. And so basically what we're kind of saying here is that in the long run, transit doesn't really seem to reduce the amount of people taking their cars. Okay, so that's the story here. So a summary of the findings there were that empirically, on average, transit investment does seem to reduce traffic congestion fairly modestly. Okay, so kind of on average, again, taking an average of a lot of different effects, some larger, some smaller. On average, if we increase transit capacity by 10%, the amount of traffic congestion or car travel drops by a little under 1%. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a lot, but if we're in this world where we have a lot of congestion, a 1% reduction in car travel could be fairly significant. Okay, but again, this is masking a lot of heterogeneity. In some effects, this might be effect bigger than 1%. In some cases, a lot of cases, it'll be 0. But on average, that's the effect that we see. And it varies a lot depending on population size, density, the types of transit we're talking about, and the timing involved as well. Okay, so we want to just kind of keep these findings in the back of our minds when we interpret the findings that we have for pollution. Okay, so again, just to kind of remind you what we're doing here, we're trying to look at how the levels of recorded pollution have varied when we've changed the level of transit capacity, controlling for all this other stuff that we expect could influence the level of pollution. Okay, so these are kind of a summary of the results here. I'm not presenting the actual numbers because they're not, I think, overly interesting. I'm just kind of give you a big picture finding. Again, this is kind of changing as we're getting more data and so forth. But as a big picture overview, I just want to go pollutant by pollutant to tell you what we've found by running this model on our data set. Okay, so again, for those 21 years, for the 96 different urban areas. The first one here is looking at carbon monoxide. Okay, so as a reference point, carbon monoxide, about a third of the pollutants come from on-road sources. Okay, so transportation sources on the road are one of the single biggest contributor of carbon monoxide, about 27 million tons in 2011, which would be relevant for the economic interpretation of does this matter, which I haven't gotten to yet. But so the results here, again, this is not the most rigorous way of showing it, but these are negative in the sense that the elasticity is negative when we increase transit supply. There's a reduction in carbon monoxide. Again, unscientifically, I'm saying it's slightly insignificant. So there's not super convincing evidence here. There's some mild evidence, which I'm still trying to parse through. There's some evidence that transit may modestly reduce carbon monoxide. That's kind of needs to be interpreted in conjunction with this finding here for Knox. Again, Knox is largely comes from on-road sources. About 38% come from on-road sources. Again, the single largest group, 6 million tons in 2011. These ones are positive. Again, there's some modest evidence here in terms of statistical significance, but it seems like transit may increase Knox slightly. Okay, so if we look at this in conjunction with the carbon monoxide, this is consistent with some of this cross-modal substitution. Okay, so if we look at over this time period, cars being fueled by gasoline, a lot of transit being fueled by diesel, this makes sense in terms of the types of pollutants that we're seeing. Okay, so this is consistent with the story that I said earlier in terms of this substitution. Okay, so we're going to see some substitution out of our cars into transit, at least in the short run, when we increase transit supply. Okay, and so this finding here is consistent with what Rivers and Schofele and Sabarian found in the study in Canada, looking at the shutdowns in terms of the labor disruptions. So we do have consistent results here in terms of the sign. Our magnitudes are different, and there's some interpretation I have there, which I can come back to you a little later. Ozone seems to have no effect in terms of what transit does to it. This makes sense if we kind of go back to the initial graph. Ozone has been pretty stable over this time period. It hasn't really changed much. On-road sources are less than 5%. So it seems to be no effect here, as best I can tell, in terms of what transit does for ozone. Particulate matter, even though the emission shares are fairly low from on-road sources, public transit, because of the diesel fuel, does seem to increase particulate matter. Okay, so PM 2.5, this is kind of the fine particles, the dust stuff that gets trapped in your lungs and can have very significant consequences. Transit seems to make this worse. Okay? Same thing for PM10, this is the slightly larger particles. Transit seems to increase these as well. Okay, so I'm still working through how to interpret this effect, whether this is large enough for us to care about, is this a meaningful amount? But statistically, it does seem to increase it somewhat at least. Okay. Sulfur dioxide, again, doesn't seem to be any effect here. Transit is a fairly small, or transportation is a fairly small contributor to sulfur dioxide, but it doesn't seem to really make a difference. Okay. So what does that really mean here? So the results here are still a work in progress. There's some additional work that I want to do to try to kind of boost my confidence in the results. So one question is, are these effects statistically zero? There's a bit more work that needs to be done there, but also what is the economic significance? Okay, so if transit seems to be increasing particulate matter, does the amount of increase really make a difference, right? In terms of the percent change, what that means in terms of the next step, in terms of health effects and so forth. So I really want to kind of parse that out to see whether this is something we should care about. And the heterogeneity story, again, I think is the real important piece here, which is kind of tough to disentangle. Okay, so I've been working a little bit about trying to understand, whether looking at these regions as a whole, whether this is kind of masking some effects that are, meaningful, others that aren't. For instance, I found that in areas with more fixed guideway transit, particularly kind of larger cities that have long established rail networks, they tend to have high existing transit accessibility and ridership in those areas that already have a fairly developed transit network. Additional transit supply does, in a meaningful way, decrease carbon monoxide, and it lessens the increase in NOx and particulate matter. Okay, so transit still makes these guys worse, but less worse than in other areas. Okay, and so I want to kind of dive into this a little bit more to understand this kind of spatial or regional heterogeneity at work here. And so if we think about, again, why this matters, if we think about the type of transit, it's not all the same. We're kind of lumping so far in the discussion all transit together, but there are different types of transit, right? So if we think about, mixed traffic transit, typically buses that are sharing the roadways, they tend to have a very low cross elasticity, right? So typically, if we increase bus service, that's not really making a big difference in terms of getting people out of their cars into the bus, right? The cross elasticity is quite low. I put a question mark here. We expect that maybe the marginal pollution per rider is a little higher here compared to the other modes, right? In terms of the type of fuel that's being used here. Adding more buses might make pollution worse, right? So you can kind of use kind of a thought experiment. If you're in some cities, a lot of these buses have very low load factors, right? You've probably observed buses that have 2 or 3 people in them. The pollution per person there is fairly high, right? So that could be one outcome. Another is thinking about fixed guideway modes, right? So if we think of commuter rail, light rail, heavy rail, these types of modes tend to have a higher cross elasticity, right? So these are the types of modes that get people to make different choices, right? So I know, just kind of anecdotally, when I moved to Toronto, we specifically got an apartment right by the subway line because the subway existed there. And people aren't making those types of choices because of buses, right? So this has the potential to really kind of influence decisions, especially in the long run, okay? My assumption is that these would have a lower marginal pollution per rider, right, in terms of load factors and thinking about pollution sources. Okay, so the cross elasticity and the pollutant level is going to vary by type of transit, which we have to be aware of as well. And so I think that this is relevant if we look at kind of what has happened in the past and also trying to use this to forecast out into the future. The type of transit matters here, right? So here I'm looking at the amount of vehicle revenue miles provided by fixed guideway. Okay, so this has increased from 34.5% to 39%. So it's saying of the transit supply, an increasing portion has been provided by fixed guideway modes. Okay, so kind of mass transit has had a higher share of transit supply and quite a bit higher share in terms of ridership. Okay, so this is the number of passenger miles traveled. It's increased from 52% to about 62%. Right, so 10 percentage points increase over that time period. So there's been more of a shift away from kind of mixed guideway modes like buses into fixed guideway modes. And so with that said, I haven't yet been able to show that this matters kind of on its own, right? And so there is kind of the complicated factor that if we look at where these types of investments tend to happen, they tend to happen in areas that are larger, that are denser, as well. So it's kind of, I think, challenging to disentangle, is it density that matters or is it the type of transit that matters? Because all of these factors are intertwined. And so that's something that I'm still trying to work through here. And so far I haven't found any direct evidence that the type of transit capacity matters or that this effect has changed over time. So if we look at, did transit have a different effect in the 90s than it did in the second decade? I haven't yet found evidence of that. So I'm still kind of interested in that question, but I don't have evidence yet. So as I said, this is still ongoing work. So I'm in the midst of extending the data set out to 2014. So some more recent data that I'll have complete soon. I'm interested in looking at the monitor level. So right now, the results that I have are looking at the average across the whole region. Okay? And so looking at the monitor level, we might be able to control for more kind of idiosyncratic factors, and I think the econometric identification will be cleaner. So that's something that I'm working on. And again, trying to explore this heterogeneity across space a little more, trying to figure out, does the environmental effect matter in some cases, and what cases are these, right? So try to really determine to say, okay, in regions with, these characteristics, we expect this effect on pollution. With these characteristics, we expect this effect. So I'd like to be able to say more about that because I think that that is really valuable for policy and planning purposes. And so I wanted to take this time to kind of segue into another project that I've been working on, which again kind of helps us kind of frame these results. So if we think about transit, again, one of the factors that I mentioned that my students tended to care about was kind of the accessibility, the equity component, along with the pollution component. And so if we think about the accessibility aspect for a bit, transit obviously is central to that, what effect we expect it to have. And we can kind of break down accessibility into two components, mobility and proximity. Okay, so proximity is looking at location decisions, land use decisions. If there was no congestion, how easy would it be to get from A to B, right? This is just the connectivity of the transit network. And the mobility part of it is looking at choices that people make, right? How congested is that? Is it difficult to get from A to B during peak times and so forth, right? And so transit can affect these two components, right? Proximity, it can affect it by changing, where people choose to live. It can change by how many minutes you are to transit. If we introduce a new transit line, before it used to take you 12 minutes, now it takes you 1 minute. It's going to change your proximity. And maybe it affects mobility in terms of its impact on congestion. But I've showed some evidence that maybe in the short run, in some areas, it could make a difference. But transit can, again, operate through those two different channels. And if we think about this kind of broader effect in a region, it's pretty messy, it's complicated, right? So this is a graph that Gilles Duranton presented in one of his addresses that I saw at the Canadian Economics Association. I kind of scribbled it down really quickly because I thought it really captures a lot of the key aspects here. And so especially if we think about kind of the long run effects of transit investment, in the context of induced demand and the fact that we don't have congestion taxes and all these other distortions, transit can have a lot of different effects over time, right? So if we think of these kind of new, infrastructure investments, just for simplicity, if we think of like a new light rail system, for instance, it can affect a lot of different things, right? It can attract more amenities, more stores want to be located close by. That makes it attractive for people to come live there, and all these effects kind of snowball, right? And so you have all these different effects going on. And in the framework that I'm trying to use here, I'm trying to capture some of this stuff. How does this all kind of settle down in equilibrium? And what effect does infrastructure, say transit infrastructure, have on pollution once this stuff is kind of shaken out, right? And so if we look at, a different approach, if we look at like a subway strike or something like that, that's not going to capture all these knock-on effects. And so again, I think that this matters, but it's hard to capture this outcome cleanly. But so this is kind of, under the surface here. And so related to transit accessibility, I've been working on a project recently, again, another work in progress. This is very close to home for most of you here. This is looking at the new BRT line, the Vine, in Vancouver, Washington. So this opened up in 2017, right? So this new BRT line, it cost $53 million. And we've been doing a case study with a couple of students at UW-Tacoma to try to figure out what effect this had on land values. Okay, and so the mechanism that we're thinking about here is the accessibility or the livability aspect of transit investments like this. Okay, and so for our purposes, for a project that we were working on, we were looking at what happened around the transit center at the Vancouver Mall. We wanted to look at what happened to property values kind of in the proximity of the mall there. To answer that question, we have about 45,000 transactions in Clark County from 2012 to 2018. Just to kind of summarize some of the findings that we've found so far. So here we're looking at the percent change in real prices over time. The dashed line here are the census tracts near the Vancouver Mall. Okay, so I can't remember offhand what my cutoff was. I think it was within a mile, something like that. And so we classified census tracts as being close to it and not close to it. So the close ones are the dashed lines, the solid line are all the other ones in the county. And we see some interesting results here. Okay, so the project was announced back in 2010. That's when the initial planning started happening. In 2015, that's when construction broke ground, and we see a big jump in prices in those census tracts. And then it opened up in January 2017, and following the opening of the line, we see another increase in property values close by. Okay, and so again, this is not controlling for other factors. This is just kind of an overview here. And so we wanted to do an approach to try to figure out how much of this is, again, caused by the spatial proximity, controlling for potential differences in the dwelling attributes and so forth across census tracts. So we were looking at accessibility here, and so we used Google Maps data to figure out for all these different transactions, how close are they to the mall in this transit center. So here it's showing driving accessibility. These are different bins by miles. So the innermost one here is showing different dwellings that are within 0.4 miles of a drive. The next one is 0.4 to 0.6 and so forth. And so we were trying to look at whether price differentials varied across space here. This is the graph for walking accessibility in terms of how many minutes it was from the dwelling to the transit center. Again, the innermost line was 10 minutes here. The next one was 10 to 15 minutes and so forth. And so what we found from our kind of hedonic model that we've run so far, these are the percent changes in prices over space. Okay, again, controlling for as many of the kind of structural attributes of the dwelling, other locational aspects as well. These are the effects due to the opening of the transit line in 2017. And so this is the 95% confidence interval. Our average value here is the mean. So properties within a 10-minute walk of the transit center went up by about 11%. 10 to 15 minutes, they went up by 7%. If it was beyond 15 minutes, there was no discernible effect on property values. And so interestingly, Pierce County at least uses 15 minutes as their cutoff for catchment area. So when they're trying to forecast how many people are likely to use transit, they happen to use 15 minutes as their cutoff, which again, kind of, I think, makes intuitive sense to me. Similar results for driving distance, the different bins here. We found no effect beyond 0.8 miles in terms of what happened to property values. Houses or dwellings beyond this distance weren't affected by the accessibility improvements. Okay, and so what is this saying? This is saying that the market is willing to pay for this transit project. Okay, and so what is the mechanism here? It's likely the accessibility improvements. Maybe there's livability improvements. If we think that this is going to stimulate transit-oriented development and make it a nicer place to live, that's going to be reflected here. Okay, so to conclude, to kind of wrap up the kind of three strands of literature that I've been looking at, I think that public transit has the potential to reduce congestion in some regions. Okay, so particularly areas that are heavily congested, transit can help. It's less likely that transit improves air quality, and it can actually make it worse. So we have to be kind of realistic there, but there may be exceptions. Again, there could be the spatial heterogeneity aspect that we need to understand a little bit more. And I should also note that this might change if there were different regulations. Okay, so this is all looking at the past. It's saying, you know, in the past, as we've increased transit supply, what has that done to car ridership? Not many people have switched. But this is also in the context of us having kind of screwed up regulations and not having things like congestion taxes, right? So if we had a congestion tax in place along with increased transit, we might see a much bigger shift, okay? And so if we think about, you know, the policy implications, we have to be aware of what other kind of overlapping policies there are, okay? And so I think the way out of congestion is kind of multi-pronged. It can't be transit on its own. It has to be transit with pricing changes, right? We need those things working together. And finally, based on the last results, transit does lead to localized, fairly localized accessibility and livability benefits, okay? So the first couple of results might seem kind of, you know, pessimistic about transit, saying, well, it doesn't really reduce congestion, it doesn't really improve the environment. That's not to say that transit investment isn't warranted, because I think it's very clear that there are pretty significant benefits. People are willing to pay to be close to transit. And so what I would really like to see is, you know, us be aware of this in terms of the political debates that we have, that people understand that, you know, transit can be beneficial, but it's going to be because of this, not because of congestion and pollution. And we have to be aware of that when we're doing cost-benefit analyses, whether these effects are actually going to be observed or not in our particular setting. Okay, so that's all that I have. So I'm welcome any questions you might have.
I'm going to start. I have, oh yeah, this doesn't project, it's just for the web. First, a clarification question, then sort of a bigger picture question. On your emission, or on the air quality findings, on each of your slides, you had a share of the emissions from mobile sources. And the ozone one, I have a big question about. So ozone is not directly emitted by anything. It's produced by reactive organic gases and Knox and the weather.
Yeah.
And on-road mobile sources, particularly in urban areas, are a significant source of ROG and Knox. So why is it only 4.5%?
Yeah, I think you're right. So I think this is just a direct effect. I think this is not the effect of combustion.
Yeah. So
That's fair.
And I guess that points to my bigger question, which is when I think about, particularly for ozone, but at the other end of the scale, carbon monoxide for mobile sources is very localized. Like you usually think of it as affecting the road corridor where the vehicles are. But on the ozone side, and maybe Knox, I'm wondering if there's a scale issue of looking at this at a whole regional scale. Because if you're going to model air quality, so if you work for the EPA or an air district or something, and you're modeling the air quality for a region, there's so many inputs to that I suspect that the percent increase in transit ridership is within the margin of error of the entire air quality model. Because it's so complex to measure air quality at a regional scale when you have so many different sources of pollution and weather, and over that time period you also have fleet turnover and et cetera. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about the scale, because I've seen other studies that have tried to do this on a corridor scale. So
yeah, no, those are great points, and those are definitely some of the challenges that we see. So So I think the localized aspect is really important. And so part of what we'd like to try to do there is to look at it monitor by monitor. And so especially if we kind of look at the network here and say, okay, well, these monitors are the ones that are close to the freeway. Are we seeing different effects there than somewhere out in a more rural setting? And does that vary by the type of pollutants and so forth?
yeah, when you say by pollutants, so that
Yeah.
would be a good approach for carbon monoxide and maybe PM, but ozone is a regional, so it would vary by pollutant.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's right. I think we would definitely be able to be a bit more confident for some pollutants than others. Yeah, so I think that's something we're aware of, and part of it is trying to understand a bit more about the atmospheric effects, especially when we think about the time scale involved here, right? So a lot of the other ones, so for instance, the Chen and Wally paper looks at the opening of a new rail line in, I can't remember where in Asia, but they look at, well, what happened within opening in the first 2 weeks of it opening, right? So it was very localized in terms of space, but also in terms of time. And so one of the, two challenges we have, one is the spatial aspect, where are we measuring this, and also the timing aspect, right? And so at this kind of regional large scale level, it's a very comprehensive data set, but we're kind of like smoothing over a lot of the timing aspects here. So we have daily observations in terms of pollutants, but at this level, we don't have like daily variation in transit supply. We have annual levels. So we're taking potentially, fluctuations across days and weeks and months in terms of pollution, and we're kind of smoothing that out over the year to look at more long run trends. And so that's certainly one of the messy things we have to challenge, and that's, I'll be the first to admit that's a limitation here. Yeah.
I mean, one thing you might think about, because there's some pollutants, like ozone is an issue. In most places, ozone is a summertime issue.
Yeah.
Carbon monoxide is often a wintertime issue. So I'm wondering if you treated each pollutant differently, thinking about the particular issues with respect to that pollutant and mobile sources, you might, maybe you don't do a year-long average for one pollutant, but you do for another. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I know we've looked at whether there are weekday effects, so looking at separating out weekday versus weekend effects in terms of, obviously, the traffic patterns and transit supply is going to vary there. Yeah, the seasonal effect's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. That's something we could do. So we have daily observations for all these pollutants. So we could look at over the course of a year if it's July and August where the action is in terms of, say, ozone, for instance, if we just isolate there. Yeah, that's a good thought. Thank you.
I was wondering, you're looking at the relationship between transit investments or transit supply on air quality outcomes. I was wondering whether, what do you think about using transit actual ridership or how that fluctuates in terms of air quality outcomes? Because if very minimal amounts of investment lead to large increases in transit ridership, I would expect that the air quality outcomes to be much more significant than a large investment that causes no new riders to come on board.
Right, yeah, so I guess the way we're treating it so far is we're not controlling for transit ridership per se, we're just looking at variation in transit supply. So we're looking at the change in transit vehicle revenue miles, so how many vehicles, how many are there, how far are they going, how often are they going. We're not looking at actual ridership, and the reason for that so far has been because of this kind of induced demand model where we're saying, okay, we increase transit supply and we let people kind of sort out whether they're going to take transit or cars. So we're not really kind of explicitly modeling whether they choose to take cars or transit. And so that's probably intertwined there in terms of the spatial heterogeneity, right? In terms of, if we increase transit in Vancouver, Washington, we might get, X% increase. If we had that same line and we drop that into Philadelphia, there's going to be more people riding that. So I assume that part of the transit ridership is probably intertwined in that heterogeneity story, but we haven't directly looked at that. So that's interesting.
Here's the microphone for the webinar. So the gases that you focus on seem to be ones that affect people's health directly. But my question is there any conclusion that you can draw about greenhouse gases or any of these gases that you've looked at that would affect global warming effects?
Yeah, so I think the focus has been more on kind of the localized pollutants. I think when we have universal mixing pollutants where the location source doesn't matter, that's going to be really tough for us to identify in this model. So we see it a bit in terms of the carbon monoxide, but I think I guess my conclusions would likely be more confident at the more regional, local level than they would be whether it's going to help mitigate climate change per se. I think it's more of a local issue in the way we're modeling it than a global one. I think the global one's certainly important. I don't think that our model is going to be able to say too much about that realistically. But.
Hey, it seems to me like because of induced demand, the only way sort of for transit to improve air quality would be to, like, while you're improving transit, constrain the capacity for car, like keep it the same or like even reduce it a little, so people make that shift. Like for example, when that light rail example, the roadway capacity was left untouched, so new trips were kind of like other people decided to use that road. That users that are now on the light rail, like they free up that space, but new people occupied it. But the only way to avoid that will be to reduce the capacity of the roadway.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that would be, as economists, that's what I would love to see. And I think one of the issues with a lot of these transit investments is, who is paying for this, right? So if we go back to the example here, kind of in my area, there's $54 billion. This has been very controversial in terms of who's paying for it. And so it's being financed in terms of partially a sales tax, partially property taxes, partially for vehicle licensing. And so this effect is being kind of shared amongst a lot of people that are not going to be using this transit system, people that may or may not be driving and contributing to congestion and pollution. And so it's not this kind of direct effect. And so from an efficiency standpoint, both in terms of from an efficiency standpoint in terms of aligning incentives properly to get people out of their cars to reduce these externalities, but also from an efficiency, or sorry, an equity or a fairness standpoint, we want people that are contributing these externalities to be the ones bearing the cost. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about congestion taxing, right? So if we have congestion pricing, or whatever term you want to use, if we use those revenues to pay for transit like this, then you have this kind of mutually reinforcing outcome where we are improving accessibility for people, and we're also decreasing some of these externalities. And so that's the my feeling is that, again, transit on its own is not going to be effective in terms of congestion and environment. We need some kind of pricing mechanism in relation, right? And so they found that if you look at the the corridor in London, looking at the effects of having a congestion tax enter downtown London, using those revenues to fund transit, there's a huge shift in people out of their cars and into transit, but it was this kind of multi-pronged approach. So yeah, no, I agree with your statement fully from my perspective.
That's all we have time for.
Thank you.